All right, well, if you don't mind introducing yourself, what is your name, where do you work, and what are your research interests?
So my name is Carole LaBonne. I am a professor at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, which is just north of Chicago. My work sits at the intersection of stem cell biology, developmental biology, and evolutionary biology. I almost didn't go to college. Ended up in college almost by accident because I went with a friend who was interviewing at University of Rochester, and in the end ended up getting a full ride to there. Was working a bunch of different work study jobs to pay for the room and board parts of it. I was working in one laboratory at the medical school. The only woman professor in the sciences that I had come across as an undergraduate, 𝘳𝘦𝘨𝘶𝘬𝘭𝘬, saw some kind of potential in me. So even though it was against the rules and she was paying me as a work study student, she started letting me do research. I didn't know, as a first-gen student, that PhD programs were free and that you got a stipend. But down the hall from Saeed's lab was the department chair, and he had kind of a little library outside his office, and I used to go sit there and do my schoolwork and read journal articles, and sometimes he would come out of his office and talk to me about what I was reading. So one day he asked me what I was doing after graduation, and he said, "You're going to take a year off and work in Saeed's lab, and then you and I are going to decide where you're going to apply to graduate school next year." He had me apply to Harvard and MIT and Hopkins, and I got into all of them. And so, it was like the second time in my life that somebody stepped in and took me wandering in the wilderness and put me back on the path. Flash forward a couple of years, and I was fortunate enough to be hired to work at the embryology course, the famed embryology course at the Marine Biological Laboratory. While I was there were two women scientists that overlap with me as module leaders, Marianne Bronner and Janet Wiley, and both of them had their young kids with them there for the summer. So Janet had 4 children, and Marianne had 2 children, and they would take the young women and we'd go sit out in the grass, and they'd do impromptu mentorship sessions about how you can intertwine having a family and running a laboratory and having a career in science. So I ended up doing my postdoc with Marianne and had my 2 kids while I was there, and Marianne worked on neural crest cells. And I had also gotten interested in that because my graduate work was on how mesoderm forms in the early embryo. And the last part of my thesis, which of course was never published because the last part of your thesis is never published, was a gene that I did some of the first in situ hybridizations on, and it was not only in the cells that I was studying during my graduate work, but it was in this population of cells that I had never heard of before that turned out to be the neural crest. But I have to say that since the first time I saw embryos developing under a microscope, I never wanted to do anything else. I have a microscope in my office, and if I don't look at embryos developing every day, I get grumpy.
If you had any advice for young scientists who are entering the world of academia, what would be the advice you'd give them?
What I would tell them is that you're going to have to trust and believe in yourself, particularly if you're a woman or from a group traditionally underrepresented in science. The phrase "fake it till you make it" people use, but it has some use because no one will ever value you higher than you project your own value. And so it's really important that even when you don't feel confident, that you learn to project at least some of that confidence. And then for the women going into science, and the men, but particularly for the women, you should never question whether you can have a career as a scientist and be a mom. I have to say that being a mother made me a better scientist, and being a scientist made me learn how to juggle balls in such a way that made me a better mother. That's another good piece of advice: learn to juggle. I don't believe in work-life balance. It's more like work-life dynamics. It changes from day to day, week to week, year to year. But the important skill is to recognize which of the balls are glass and will shatter if you drop them, and which one are just going to bounce and you can catch them later.